Good morning and welcome to a very cold January morning. As many of you guys know, I love to forage mushrooms, and at this time of year there's not a lot going on. There's a handful of mushrooms you might find, winter chanterelles, oysters, a few others. But today's a very different video. I'm actually going to show you how you can grow your own mushrooms. So I actually bought my mum and her partner a little Christmas present this year, a little bag of mold. It's not. It's actually little wooden dowels with little spiral grooves in them, and these have been inoculated. I got them two different types. We've got the pearl oysters and we've got shiitakes. Pearl oysters, fantastic, delicious edible. Shiitakes, delicious edible, but also highly medicinal. So today I'm going to show you how to select the wood that you need and how to inoculate them with these beautiful little plugs. We'll get stuck straight in and I'll show you what you're going to need. So thankfully the process is pretty straightforward. You don't need any fancy tools. What you are going to need, that you might struggle to get hold of, is some good hardwood. Now luckily my mum's partner is an arborist, so he's got plenty of wood. What I'd maybe recommend is that you get in touch with a local arborist. There's a good chance that they could be doing a job soon where they could get you some seriously good logs and hopefully wouldn't charge you too much for them. I'll explain what kind of wood you need in a minute. So outside of the wood, it's pretty simple. We need our plugs, the instruction manual, that's like the general instructions, and then gourmetmushroom.co.uk has been kind enough to give me a guide for the pearl oyster and for the shiitake. Next, you're going to want a pen to mark on the logs. You'll need a measuring tape because we need to know the thickness of the logs and the length of the logs. You will probably need a pruning saw. It depends on how the wood's delivered to you. As you can see on these logs, all the little branches, they've all been trimmed off. The other thing that you'll need is an 8mm drill bit because that's how thick these plugs are. You're going to need a drill. My drill is currently charging. You're going to need some electrical tape, and we're going to need a mallet. The final thing you're going to need, you're going to want a chainsaw or a good sized bow saw, something that's going to allow you to cut logs. But hopefully if you've managed to get pally with an arborist, he might just cut it down to size for you and save you a lot of hard, sweaty work if all you have is a handsaw. So let's talk over how this works. Mushrooms begin with spores. Think of them like seeds. They will land on soil or wood, and then they'll send out what are called hyphae, which are tiny little fibers. Those hyphae are in search of food. The whole system of hyphae is called the mycelium. So think of it as the roots of a tree, roots of a plant. They go out hunting for food, and when they find food, then they can grow in a larger mass. And then once that mass gets big enough, whether it's popped out of the surface of the soil or it's popped out the side of the wood, and once it comes in contact with air, the mycelium recognizes that that's a place that it could grow a fruiting body, otherwise known as a mushroom. So then the mushroom pops up, it grows nice and big, and it drops a shit ton of spores. Cycle continues. So what we're doing here is impregnating the wood, but it's called inoculating, by putting these little mycelium plugs into the wood. Then the mycelium will grow through the wood, eating the wood, and then it'll pop out lots of mushrooms that we can eat. It's a very complicated system, but I hope I've explained that in a way that's easy to understand. So there's a couple of reasons I chose the mushrooms that I did. One, they're good for beginners. Two, they very much like growing in British climate. And the third reason is that both these mushroom species like to grow on the same types of wood. It says that all hardwoods are suitable. So if you're going to buy these mushroom dowels, make sure and research the types of wood that it likes to grow on. So the wood needs to be green. It needs to be fresh felled, but it needs to be left for at least 2 weeks. The reason for that is that wood actually contains antifungal properties. So after a couple of weeks, the antifungal properties are pretty much lost, which means it's time to inoculate. The shiitakes and the oysters need roughly the same size log. They need to be at least 15 centimeters, but we're looking for 15 to 20 centimeters. So the length of the log doesn't actually matter really, but it's important to know how long the log is. So the rule for this is that you need 30 plugs per half meter, which means I need 8 half-meter pieces, and if they're not half-meter, then my mum's partner is going to whip his chainsaw out and he's going to cut them down. So that one's a good size, but as you'll notice, there's a great big branch that's been cut off here. We're really looking for lengths that don't have branches on them. So there we go, the width for that one's fantastic. That's 16 centimeters, and then we've got a length of 60 centimeters. So that one is great. Bloody hell, these things are heavy. Looking at this one, you'd think that's a really bad choice because of all of this, but the half meter is probably about there. That is a beautifully perfect log. Now, I should have said earlier, the reason you don't want knots and branches and bits like that, if you think about the inside of the wood, if you were to split this, the grain would be beautifully and straight. Think of it like a road, really easy for a car to drive along there. When it gets to here, it's like some mangled ass T-junction. If it has to go around all these bends and corners, it's going to move slower. So a log like this, the mycelium can travel along the grain very, very easily. Now, something else I need to mention. This log in here is too big for a start, so it wouldn't be getting used. But notice this. Now, might just be a mold, could be anything. Does that mean the wood wouldn't grow your mushroom? Not necessarily, but it is going to start a battleground. Let's say your oyster mushrooms, and then whatever the hell that is is also going to want the wood, and they're going to fight each other. So there's a chance that your oyster mushroom will be killed off by this other species. The other problem you might run into is that you grow your mushrooms, but they could be infected with a type of mold that is present on this wood. And the third and final option is that you might grow a different mushroom. Your mycelium from your oyster dies, that mycelium, whatever the hell it is, wins, and it grows, and you go, oh yay, my oysters are ready. You go out, you pick them, you eat them, you die. So it's important that the log is lovely and fresh, like this one. No contamination whatsoever. So there we have it, 8 beautiful logs. So each of these logs is at least 50 centimeters, which means they're going to need cut down. They don't have to be 50 centimeters, they could be 65 centimeters, but you'd have to run some maths to figure out how many plugs you would need for that length of wood. So you want to give the log a quick inspection, making sure there's no knots. If there's knots, you want to measure from the opposite side to get the length. This one is probably one of the best logs. It's nice and straight, no blemishes, no knots on it. 50 centimeters, just mark it. And then just to make things a little bit easier, gonna mark an X. That's the piece that needs to come off, and then that log will be ready to go. Okay, so that's 8 logs cut down to 50 centimeters beautifully, and now they're ready to be inoculated. I've now got the drill, which is charged. I can't not push the button, I don't know what it is yet. Just have to. And as recommended by the instructions, I've got an 8mm drill bit in there. It's for wood. You can tell it's for wood because it's got a tiny little point on the end, which helps draw the sawdust out of the log. The depth of the drill bit needs to be 1.5 times the length of the dowel. So it's essentially 4 centimeters. So we're going to be looking at a depth of the holes of 6 centimeters. So 6 centimeters of depth means here. Wrap it around a couple of times. So we need to drill this deep into these logs, 30 in each log, 240 holes in total. I've come all the way into the woods to get away from the sound of chainsaws and chopping logs. Now the spacing is relatively important on this. You want every single hole to be equal distance away from each other. The instructions say to leave 2.5 centimeters from the end of each log, so you want to ignore that part. So we're looking at having 6 centimeters between each plug. So what I'm going to do is one row will have 8 plugs, the next is going to have 7 plugs, the next will have 8 plugs, and then the next will have 7 plugs. And if you imagine the end of the log, that's going to be at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. Oh, job done. There we go, all 8 logs inoculated. That's the shiitakes and that's the pearl oyster. So I want to just take a second to talk about waxing. Not my legs, but these mushroom logs. Where you inoculate, a lot of guides online tell you to put wax over the top. The wax is there to help protect those plugs from drying out and from contamination. I have read some mixed reviews, some people saying it's not 100% necessary. Because mine are going in a shed in winter in Scotland, I'm not worried about these logs drying out, and I'm not really worried about contamination. If you want to wax them, then it is extremely simple. You buy food grade wax, melt that down, and just take a paintbrush and you just paint over the top once you've hammered that plug in. You don't have to do the ends of the logs, just where the plugs have gone in. Food grade wax is the best. Beeswax is okay, but I have read that some insects eat beeswax, so it's maybe not the best. It's also more expensive, so you're probably just wasting money there. As I say, I'm not going to wax these, but if you're living in a warmer, drier climate, or you're doing this at a warmer time of year, I would definitely recommend it. But for me, being in Scotland in the middle of winter, I'm not too worried. Good morning guys, and welcome to day 2. Today we're going to be moving these inoculated mushroom logs into a place where they can begin the spawn run. So this is the second phase of growing your own mushrooms in logs. So where do you need to store these logs? Well, basically the best place is indoors, not in your living room, not inside your house, not inside anywhere heated, but inside a barn, a log store, an outhouse. The most important thing about storing the logs is that they're out of direct sunlight and they're not getting battered by wind. Lots of wind is going to dry those logs out really quick, as is direct sunlight, and that's the main risk. If those logs go dry, that mycelium is going to die. It's also essential during this stage that the logs are not on the ground. So if you happen to have a sheltered area but it's soil on the ground, you're going to have to put a pallet down or some struts of wood to raise those off the ground. If it's in contact with the ground, you're going to find other fungi, bacteria, stuff like that climbing up from the soil into the log and contaminating your grow. So luckily my mum's partner's got a nice little space in the shed, so I'm going to get in there with a brush, sweep it out, kind of not sanitize it, but just clean it up a little bit. That's kicked up an awful lot of dust, so I'm just going to let that settle, and in the meantime I can go get these logs. So let's go grab a wheelbarrow and get them moved up here. That was a lot heavier than I expected. When I stacked them, I made sure and did them different directions. So the shiitakes are going that way, and then the oysters are going that way. You might have noticed there's direct sunlight. That's not ideal. What I'll probably do is once everything's stacked in, I'll find a piece of wood and just create a shade. So I'm actually just going to shuffle these a little bit, create a wee bit of a gap between the bottom two, and then run the other two like that. You need a little bit of airflow. You don't want the logs drying out, but they do need gaps like this. I'm actually going to stack these 4 front logs, which are the shiitake mushrooms, on top of the oysters. I'm just going to put something between them so there's no cross-contamination. So I'm just going to lay a sheet of that over the top and stack up the other 4, so it's taking up less space. And that's it. We've got 4 oysters, Jenga stacked on the bottom, and then 4 shiitakes also stacked. These now need to be left for 3 months, and then I'll start checking the end of the logs, and I'll be looking for a white star pattern that shows that the mycelium is spreading throughout the log. And then it'll be on to the next stage, which involves taking them outside. Finally, I've just went and put another square of Reflectix right there to protect it from the tiny bit of sunlight that comes through here for about an hour a day. So it's recommended that you give the logs a good soak after the spawn run. So I'm just going to load the logs into this old tin bath and let them soak for a day. So I've had these logs soaking for 24 hours now, so I'm going to whip them out and store them somewhere nice and damp and shaded. You don't want the logs being in direct sunlight, and you don't want too much wind to get into them because it will dry them out and then the mushrooms will die. So I'm actually going to move these logs down to the bottom of my mum's garden. There's a little unused bit down here, just behind the apple trees. It's mostly just nettles and stuff. And it'll be the perfect spot because it's nice and shaded and it's not exposed to the wind. I'm going to put down some struts of wood just to make sure the logs aren't in direct contact with the soil. Tell you what, this is a relatively long process. The setup and stuff's not too bad. Doing all the drilling and that, it was all right, but you have to wait potentially a year or more until these will start fruiting. But then it's going to feel like free mushrooms. Safe to say, these are absolutely soaking. So this process is sometimes called shocking the logs, and it helps encourage the mushrooms to start producing. Now that they're nice and damp, it simulates big heavy rainfalls, and then the mycelium knows once the temperature's right, time to start kicking out mushrooms. So long as enough mycelium has spread for the logs, of course. Anyway, let's move these down to the bottom of the garden and clear a little space for them. Hello, Puss Puss. So I've actually changed my mind just a little bit, and I'm going to stack these logs on top of bricks. There's a great big pile of them here, and the main reason is if I put wood on the ground and then the logs on top, the moisture from the soil will eventually move through whatever wood I use, unless it's coated in plastic or paint or something, which I don't really want in contact with my mushroom logs. There's a space here, it's got a clear canopy above it, but it's not going to get direct sunlight because east is there, so the sun's going to come over that area there, and there's just trees all throughout this spot. If it does get sunlight, it's going to be very minimal, and because I'm in Scotland, it's pretty wet up here, so I'm not too worried about them drying out. Plus, there's a river just a stone's throw through the woods there. So even if we get a drought, there'll be a trickle coming through that river, and I can just go dunk the logs again. So I'm going to quickly clear out this space, build a platform, and stack the logs up, and try and not get stung. Right, let's see if I can build a nice flat platform for these logs to sit on where they're not just going to roll off. It's not very flat, so it might take a bit of work. I'm going to do the first logs this direction, so I'm putting the bricks the opposite direction. God, they're definitely a lot heavier now they've been soaked. So I'm going for the two biggest ones on the bottom, just like that. So really I want to keep a bit of space in between these, because if they're touching, it's kind of reducing the amount of surface area that we can get mushrooms growing on. In hindsight, I should have planned for this before and left a little bit of a gap here. And then by putting that brick that way up, I've created a tiny little separator, and it's left a nice little channel here of a couple inches. Now we're just going to go on top with the next two, just make sure it's not going to roll off. And there we have it, the first stack. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the shiitakes. Oh, I just took a wheelbarrow handle in the ass. God. I'm going to go get the pearl oysters now and stack them on top, just the same Jenga style as I've done here. Piece of advice, choose a flat piece of ground to do this on. Otherwise you're going to be sat trying to balance them. We're getting there. Looks good to me. Work of art. Well, there we have it. 8 half-metre mushroom logs ready to fruit. Now the painful bit, we just have to wait. And I wish I could show the result in this video, but it takes time. Like I say, might be this year, might be next year. But the great news is when these start producing mushrooms, they'll continue to produce for 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. It depends on the size of the log and the type of mushroom you're growing. These logs can produce kilograms of the stuff. So I can't wait to see what happens here and to eat some of these homegrown organic mushrooms. So there's not a lot you have to do now. You have to sit and wait, but more importantly, you do need to keep an eye on these logs to make sure they don't dry out, especially in the summer months. You're looking for any cracking on them whatsoever. If that happens, you want to dunk these for 24 hours in water and then stack them back up. So we'll be keeping an eye on these logs. It's not going to happen overnight. They're not going to suddenly just dry and split. So keep an eye out for cracks, dunk them for 24 hours if the logs seem dry, and of course, look out for mushrooms. Depends what species you've got. If you read the manual that comes with them, I'm sure it'll tell you when to expect the mushrooms. Well, that's as much as I can cover now. You might get a video in 2 years' time of me stuffing my face with mushrooms. I sure hope so. But of course, if you have any questions on anything I've covered, maybe I missed something or something wasn't quite clear enough, just drop it in the comments and I'll do my best to answer it. Thank you for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.